Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you emotional and heartwarming tales that explore the complexities of life, love, and the unexpected twists that shape our journey. In today's story, a billionaire CEO, caught up in the world of power and success, is unexpectedly drawn back to his past by a young pianist playing a melody that no one else should know. What starts as a chance encounter turns into a life-altering revelation that will change everything. Join us as we delve into a story of love, loss, and the search for family. Subscribe to the channel to begin today's story. It was the kind of hotel bar that made a man feel both invisible and entirely exposed. Dim lighting, dark wood, and the soft clinking of glasses created a quiet refuge from the chaos of a long conference. Dylan Hayes, the billionaire CEO of Talon Industries, had spent the last 10 hours enduring endless handshakes, nods, and speeches that meant nothing. The investors he'd met, only concerned with how much money he could make them, felt like faceless strangers. He was tired, not just from the exhausting day but from the constant pressure of living up to an image, of being someone others admired. Someone untouchable. He had always prided himself on his ability to shut out his emotions, to control his thoughts, to build an empire. But tonight, standing alone at the bar with a whiskey in hand, it all felt a little too heavy. He leaned against the bar, letting out a slow breath as he gazed into the amber liquid swirling in his glass. Silence. For once, there was nothing to think about, no one to impress. But then the music started. At first, it was just a faint melody, slipping between the low murmur of conversation like something familiar. Like a distant memory. His brow furrowed. It felt like something he should know. Something that belonged to his past but was lost to time. He didn't know why it pulled at him so sharply. The notes were soft, careful, like the delicate sound of something fragile being brought back to life. As the melody settled in, Dylan's fingers tightened around the glass, his heart suddenly beating faster. The lullaby, his lullaby, the one he had written in the dead of night. Hands hovering over piano keys, heart heavy with grief. It was the song he had composed for the child he lost. The one he would never see. A life, a dream, a future that had been torn away from him. No one else knew that song. No one could. He turned toward the piano, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room, searching for the source of the music. A young man, no older than his early 20s, was playing. He wore a worn leather jacket over a button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up in a way that suggested habit rather than fashion. Dark hair curled slightly at his forehead, and his fingers danced over the keys with an effortless confidence. He wasn't looking down at the piano, he wasn't hesitating. It was as if the music lived inside him. Dylan forced himself to breathe, trying to steady his racing thoughts. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe by some strange twist of fate, this young pianist had come up with something identical to the lullaby. But then, the pianist tilted his head slightly, adding a variation, one that Dylan had almost forgotten. A small shift in the notes that Olivia used to hum when she thought he wasn't listening. His heart pounded in his chest as the familiar melody filled the room, pulling him back to a time he'd buried so deep. He'd almost convinced himself it was gone forever. That song, the song he had written for their child, for a future that was never meant to be. The pianist lingered on the final note, stretching it out before sighing and leaning back, clearly relaxed, his fingers flexing like he did this every night. Dylan set his glass down and crossed the room, feeling the weight of his past catching up with him with every step. That song, Dylan said, his voice neutral as he stood near the piano. Where did you learn it? The young man looked up at him, surprised, then smiled. Didn't think anyone would recognize that one. He tapped a rhythm on the wood of the piano bench as he spoke. My mom used to hum it when I was a kid. Said it was special. Dylan's insides tensed, but he kept his face blank. Special how? The young man shrugged casually, clearly not aware of the storm stirring in Dylan's chest. Don't know. She never told me much. Just said it came from someone she once knew. I guess I picked it up along the way. Dylan's thoughts spiraled. He swallowed hard. Olivia. It had to be her. That song. It was hers. Their song. The melody of their past. The memory of a love that had never quite died. Even though everything else had fallen apart. What's your mother's name? Dylan asked. His voice tight, betraying the calm he was desperately trying to maintain. The young man's grin widened slightly, amused by the sudden interest. A detective or something, he joked. Something like that, Dylan replied, forcing himself to keep his tone steady. The pianist studied him for a moment. Then with a small chuckle, extended his hand. Nolan Scott. The name landed like a punch to Dylan's ribs. Nolan. It was his name. The name of the child he never knew. The child he had tried to forget. Dylan stood frozen for a moment, his hand trembling as he reached out to shake Nolan's offered hand. Nolan Scott. Dylan repeated, the name tasting foreign in his mouth. I know your mother. Nolan smirked, clearly enjoying the reaction he was getting. But Dylan didn't hear the next words. His mind had already spiraled into chaos. Could it be? Could this young man be his son? Was it possible? I didn't expect that song to bring back so many memories, Nolan said, his smirk fading as he noticed Dylan's distant expression. But, hey, he added, turning to play a few more notes. If you know it well enough, you could always play along. Dylan blinked, his fingers twitching involuntarily. It had been years since he'd touched a piano, since he'd allowed himself to feel anything about the past. He considered the offer for a moment but dismissed it with a shake of his head. I'll pass, he said smoothly, trying to keep his voice steady. But you play well. Nolan gave him a curious look, one eyebrow raised. Thanks, but I don't think you came all the way over here just to flatter me. Dylan glanced briefly toward the bartender, then back at Nolan. I was just curious. Nolan wasn't convinced, but he didn't press further. Instead, he gestured to the empty seat beside him. All right, well, if you ever want a lesson, mystery man, just let me know. Dylan nodded, his thoughts already elsewhere. He dropped a generous tip on the bar and leaned in closer to the bartender. Tell me everything you know about him, he said in a low voice. The bartender looked briefly at Nolan, who was still at the piano, then leaned in. Plays here a couple times a week, he said. Mostly keeps to himself, but the crowd likes him. His mom owns an art studio downtown. Dylan's heart skipped a beat. Olivia. It had to be her. He nodded, pushing the money closer. If you find out anything else, let me know. As he turned to leave, the melody of the lullaby still echoed in his mind, pulling him back to a life he had left behind. The night felt heavier as Dylan walked through the hotel's grand lobby, the haunting melody still clinging to his thoughts. He had spent years locking certain doors in his memory, keeping them shut with the kind of discipline only a man like him could manage. But in just a few minutes, a stranger had played a song that had pried them open like they were never locked at all. The lullaby, Olivia's lullaby. He had tried to push the thoughts aside, tried to convince himself that it didn't matter, that the years of separation, of running from the past, had erased any lingering connection. But as the notes of the song swirled in his mind, everything he had believed about his life began to crumble. He couldn't ignore it. The possibility of it, the possibility that Nolan could be his son, seemed so real now. So undeniable. By morning, Dylan's mind was still spinning. He knew exactly what he had to do, though it wasn't a decision he took lightly. He needed answers, and he knew who could get them. Carla Turner, his assistant, was efficient, she always had been. When Dylan called her in the middle of the night with a clip request to find out everything she could about Nolan Scott, she didn't question him, she simply did as he asked. By the time Dylan arrived at his suite the next morning, Carla had already compiled a thorough report, which she handed over without a word, adjusting her sleeve as he flipped through the pages. He plays at a few places around town, mostly bars and small events. Carla summarized. Dropped out of music school 2 years ago. Lives with his mother, Sarah Scott. She owns a small gallery and teaches art workshops. Nothing that brings in real money. They're comfortable, but not wealthy. Dylan's grip tightened on the report as he read Sarah's name. It was her. She had kept this part of their past hidden. Even from Nolan, he could feel the weight of it pressing on him. Everything he had missed. Everything he had lost. His birthday. Dylan muttered, his voice tight. When's his birthday? Carla glanced at him, flipping to the next page in the report. August 15th, she said casually. Dylan exhaled slowly, his thoughts swirling. It lined up too well. Too perfectly. He had known Olivia during that time. During those months before everything fell apart. Had she kept it from him? Had she known all along and simply never told him? As he set the report down, Dylan's thoughts turned to the next step. He had to see Sarah. He had to confront her. For all the years they had spent apart. For all the years he had avoided facing the truth. There was only one thing left to do now. He had to know. The gallery was in the quieter part of town, tucked between a bookstore and a small cafe that smelled of freshly baked bread and roasted coffee beans. It was the kind of place Sarah had always loved, a haven of creativity. Far removed from the world Dylan had built for himself. As soon as he stepped inside, the faint scent of paint and varnish hit him, and he felt an odd pang of nostalgia. The walls were lined with works of art, each piece carrying Sarah's unmistakable touch, bold strokes, rich colors, emotion in every detail. He made his way toward the back, where Sarah was adjusting a canvas on an easel. It had been 20 years. But she hadn't changed. There was still that quiet confidence in the way she moved, an air of self-assurance that had always drawn him in. When she turned and saw him, there was no gasp, no stumble. She simply tilted her head, studied him for a moment, and then let out a low laugh. Well, she said with a touch of amusement. The billionaire returns. Dylan couldn't help but smile slightly at her dry humor. Should I be flattered or worried? He asked. She leaned against the table, crossing her arms, and eyed him with that same sharp gaze. That depends. Are you still angry at me? He huffed a small laugh. I wouldn't call it anger. More like mild irritation, with occasional moments of satisfaction when I remember I was right. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Right about what? That you'd regret choosing your career over me. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. I wouldn't call it regret. More like a told you so moment. But that's not why you're here. Is it? Dylan's gaze softened, his mind still tangled with the possibility of what he might learn. No, he said, his voice dropping. I'm here for something else. Sarah's posture shifted, sensing the seriousness of his tone. What do you want, Dylan? He hesitated for just a moment, the words heavy on his tongue. Nolan, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He played the song last night. The lullaby. My song. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered, recognition. Maybe, or acknowledgement of the inevitability of this moment. I know, she said quietly. He's always known it, but I never told him about you. Dylan took a step closer, his heart pounding. Did you tell him where it came from? She sighed, rubbing a hand over her forehead. I never told him your name. I didn't think it mattered. Her voice softened. It was just a song. Something I hummed to him when he was a baby. It soothed him. Dylan swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing against him. Is he mine? Sarah's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then, simply, she looked at him. I had him, Dylan, a few months after we split. I never knew what happened to you after that. Dylan stood there, frozen for a moment, the words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. I had him, Dylan, Sarah had said, and with those words, something inside him cracked open. All these years, he had convinced himself that their separation had sealed off the possibility of what they could have had. He had thrown himself into his work, into building the empire that had become his entire identity, never allowing room for the love that had once meant everything to him. But now, standing before Sarah, hearing her speak of their son, it felt like the past was suddenly alive again, crawling out of the corners he had sealed so tightly. He had been right all along. In some strange way, All those years of wondering, of doubting. And yet he had never asked the right questions. He had been too afraid to face the truth. Now, it was in front of him. He had a son. But the truth, it seemed, was never simple. Even now, with the weight of what he was hearing, Dylan could feel the enormity of it all pressing down on him. He took a slow breath, trying to steady himself. "Did you ever think about telling me?" he asked, his voice a little tighter than he intended. "Did you ever think that I had the right to know?" Sarah crossed her arms, her face unreadable. "I never thought it mattered. Dylan, after everything we went through, after how things ended." Her voice trailed off, and for a moment, it seemed like the years of silence between them had built a wall that neither of them knew how to break down. Dylan shook his head, frustration and something else, regret, maybe, tightening in his chest. "You kept this from me. You kept him from me." Sarah's eyes softened, a flicker of something resembling guilt passing through them. "I didn't keep him from you, Dylan, I kept him from this," she said, gesturing around the gallery. "The world you live in. I didn't want him to be part of that. I didn't want him to grow up thinking that everything is about numbers and deals and power." Dylan exhaled sharply, feeling the sting of her words. She was right, of course. His life had been consumed by business, by his image, by the need to control everything. In many ways, he had lost touch with what really mattered. And now, standing before him, was a reminder of what he had abandoned. "Does he know?" Dylan asked, his voice low. "Does Nolan know who I am?" Sarah hesitated. "Not completely. I've never told him your name. I've never told him about you. I didn't think it was necessary." The realization hit him like a wave. Nolan didn't know. All this time, he had played the lullaby, carrying with him a piece of Dylan's past without even realizing it. And yet, it wasn't just the music that had connected them. There was something more, something Dylan couldn't explain. Something deep inside him that knew. Before Dylan could say anything more, the sound of footsteps interrupted him. He turned just in time to see Nolan walking into the gallery. His usual carefree swagger replaced by something more guarded. He looked between Dylan and Sarah, clearly sensing the tension in the room. "Is this the part where someone finally tells me what's going on?" Nolan's voice was casual, but there was a note of confusion in it. Dylan's heart raced as he turned to face the young man. There he was, standing in front of him. The embodiment of everything Dylan had thought was lost. He had imagined this moment so many times, and yet nothing could have prepared him for how real it felt. How overwhelming it was. Nolan raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking between them. "So, what? This is some long-lost family reunion. Or what?" Dylan opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah cut him off. "You don't have to hear this right now, Nolan." But Dylan wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not when everything he had been questioning was suddenly staring him in the face. "No, it's time," Dylan said firmly. He stepped forward, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. "Nolan," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I think I might be your father." Nolan stared at him, then at Sarah, as if waiting for the punchline to land. But the silence between them stretched longer than either of them expected. Finally, Nolan spoke, his voice a mixture of disbelief and humor. "Oh, really? That's a good one. Did my mom put you up to this?" But Dylan wasn't joking. The truth hung in the air. And Nolan, slowly, began to process it. His face faltered for just a moment, the smirk slipping. "Wait," Nolan said slowly, as if the words were starting to sink in. "You're serious?" Dylan nodded, watching as Nolan's expression shifted from confusion to something deeper, something Dylan wasn't sure he was ready for. As the silence lingered in the room, Dylan could see the shift in Nolan's eyes. It was as though the world had just tilted on its axis. And neither of them knew what would come next. Nolan looked between Dylan and Sarah, as if searching for the punchline, the joke he had missed. But there was no laughter this time. No witty remark. After a long beat, Nolan exhaled slowly, his expression still uncertain. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Dylan swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. The truth was, he didn't know. Everything he had built, everything he had thought mattered, seemed insignificant in the face of this one truth. He was standing in front of his son. It didn't matter how much wealth he had, how much power he had wielded. What mattered was the chance to do better, to rebuild what had been lost. I don't know, Dylan finally admitted, his voice steady but laced with emotion. But I want to be part of your life, Nolan, if you'll let me. Nolan was quiet for a long time, his gaze searching Dylan's face as if trying to gauge the sincerity in his words. Finally, he shrugged, a small grin tugging at the corner of his lips. Well, I guess I can't say no to that. But, hey, he added, his usual playful tone returning. You might want to start practicing the piano again. You've got a lot of catching up to do. Dylan chuckled softly, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe it was time to finally stop chasing everything that didn't matter and start building what truly did. As they sat down together, sharing stories and laughter, Dylan realized that family wasn't about the past or the mistakes made. It was about being there now. And he was finally ready to be. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming and emotional life stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.